you awaken from a shallow sleep. For a moment, you mistake the warm twilight for dawn, but then you remember it's still night. In the Finnish summer, midnight is almost indistinguishable from morning. From where you lie inside your tent, the night sounds perfectly peaceful. Crickets chirp softly outside, and not far away, the lake's gentle waves slap rhythmically against the shore. It's an idyllic setting, yet you can't shake the sense that something is wrong, something imminent. Tense music. Then you hear a crunch of foliage outside the tent, sound of a rope snapping. Then a quick twang, the sound of a tent cord snapping taut and then breaking. Someone is cutting the ropes that hold your tent up. You try to escape, but the tent is already collapsing down around you, smothering your cries for help. June 1960. The journey to the lake was June 4th, 1960. A pair of motorcycles drove through the countryside of southern Finland carrying 4 teenagers and their camping gear. On one motorcycle sat Seppo Boisman and his girlfriend Anja Tuulikki-Maki. The other was driven by Niels Gustafsson, with his girlfriend Mila Bjorklund on the back. Mila's 16th birthday was coming up, so it was the perfect excuse for the friends to escape the city for a weekend camping trip. Soon, their destination, Lake Bodom, came into view. The lake was about 3 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide, surrounded by pine and birch trees that made it feel quite remote, despite its relatively close proximity to the city of Espoo. At an intersection near the lake, they stopped at a roadside stand. The middle-aged woman working the kiosk was less than pleasant to them. She seemed wary of their group, and when asked about camping, she suggested they stay far away from the lake. Confused but undeterred, the group bought some soda and beer, then headed off to find a campsite. As they pulled away, Mela shot a glance back at the stand. The woman was watching them go. Mela found herself wondering whether it was safe to camp here. She had already noticed that there weren't many tents set up along the lake shore. There were plenty of hikers and swimmers, but it seemed odd that there weren't more overnight campers on a weekend. As they scoured the lake shore for a campsite, Mila, Niels, Seppo, and Anja encountered a handful of day trippers, people there for hiking or fishing. They made sure to find a nice, secluded space to set up. It wasn't long before they found the perfect spot, a small outcropping on the south shore, right by the water but screened from public view by the trees. They leaned their 2 motorcycles against nearby trees and pitched a small tent that was just big enough to fit them all inside. Mela kept thinking back to the woman at the kiosk, the look she gave them, her cryptic warning. She hoped they wouldn't get in trouble for staying here. Since this was her birthday celebration, she'd feel awful if something happened. But her concerns started to evaporate as everyone settled in by the lake. It had been an especially hot summer, so the cool breeze over the water was just what they needed. The boys cracked open their beers. Anja stopped complaining about how annoying her dad was about letting her go on this trip. And finally, Mila relaxed as well. The day came to an end, but the sun didn't set. Though they were in southern Finland, they were still close enough to the Arctic Circle that the sun never fully set in the summer. It dipped low until it was barely touching the horizon and stayed there. And as night fell, the sky dimmed to a sort of warm twilight, a phenomenon known as a midnight sun. All in all, it gave everything a beautiful, eerie look. By 2 a.m., both of the boys were drunk and Anja was sleeping. This gave Mela enough privacy to make a quick entry in her diary, made possible by the light of the midnight sun. She wrote that the boys were still awake and that Seppo was out fishing. She didn't write for long, and soon she was putting away her diary to try to get some sleep. That entry would be her final words. The morning of the crime, 9 hours. Later, on the shores of Lake Bodom, the midnight sun had brightened to a warm summer's day once again. A local man, Esko Johansson, arrived with his 2 sons. They took in the stunning scene before them. If today was going to be anything like yesterday, it would be perfect weather for swimming. They made a brisk walk toward the lakeshore, eager to plunge into the refreshing water. Yet on their way, an unusual sight stopped them. From a distance, it looked like a pile of trash. Suddenly, Esko seemed tense, uneasy. He stopped both his sons from walking any farther and told them to stay where they were. He was going to go investigate and make sure everything was all right. He approached and saw that the pile of trash was actually a tent. It had collapsed in on itself, and there were dark stains all over the shredded cloth. It looked like blood. As he drew nearer, his fears were confirmed. Tense music. There was a bruised and mutilated boy lying on top of the tent and the body of a young girl partially concealed by the torn fabric. Immediately, Esko ran to the nearest phone and called 112, Finland's emergency services number. Within an hour, the police were swarming the scene. The body that had first drawn Esko's attention was that of Niels. He was barefoot and covered in blood. His face and skull showed signs of intense blunt force trauma, and the tent beneath him was slashed to ribbons. The other body spilling out of the tent belonged to Mela, and the state of her body was even more horrifying. Her bones were broken, and she was covered with deep stab wounds. She had been stripped from the waist down. Inside the tent, the police found both Seppo and Anya with similar wounds all over their bodies, though none as extreme as Mayla's. Each of the teenagers had been stabbed and bludgeoned. They all had broken jaws and severely fractured skulls. While searching the tent, the police made a shocking discovery. Niels was still alive. The 18-year-old boy stirred, moaning in pain. Blood bubbled up from his mouth. He couldn't do anything besides moan. His severely broken jaw prevented him from speaking, and an ambulance immediately whisked him off to the nearest hospital. By this point, bystanders were already starting to crowd around the crime scene, morbidly curious about all the commotion. As the number of bystanders grew, it became clear that the police had neglected to set up a perimeter. The crime scene became an absolute mess, with countless pieces of forensic evidence trampled or lost. Tense, chilling music. Amidst the commotion, what police were able to piece together was this. There was no obvious murder weapon, though the tent had been slashed as if by some sort of blade. It seemed the attacker had struck at them from outside the tent, and the teenagers had fought to escape before succumbing to their injuries. Out of everyone, Niels was the only one who managed to get out. The tent itself seemed to have been roughly ransacked, its contents scattered around the woods. A few key items were missing, including the wallets and watches belonging to the boys, the shoes that Niels had been wearing, and the motorcycle keys. However, even so, the motorcycles had not been stolen, as both were still parked near the campsite. Mayla still had her diary on her, but it didn't provide any substantial clues. The only thing of note was that she was still awake at 2 a.m. and that both boys were drunk, though this was unsurprising for a pair of teenagers on a weekend getaway. The police also found the shoes that belonged to Niels, about 1 kilometer from camp. They were half buried in the undergrowth and covered in blood. A couple of birdwatchers came forward to police with the description of a potential suspect, a tall, blond man with a square jaw. They claimed that they saw him near the campsite in the early hours of the morning. This was corroborated by a 14-year-old boy who was fishing around 6 a.m. and claimed to have seen a blond man standing beside the shredded tent from afar. Neither the fishermen nor the birdwatchers, however, were close enough to see the bodies. Locals continued to come forward with their own theories and suspects, and soon the police were overwhelmed. What they really needed was for Niels, the sole survivor, to help make sense of all this information. He was recovering from his injuries, unable to talk to anyone, but the police were certain that once they had his account of what took place that night, the story would fall into place. But there was only one problem. As he lay in his hospital bed, Niels couldn't remember a thing. The investigation and the suspects. Later on, when Niels was finally able, he gave a short statement to the police. He remembered little to nothing of the day before. His only memory of the attack was that of a dark shape, which he glimpsed through the holes in their tent. Any other crucial details had been lost in the head trauma he suffered. The police, drowning in clues offered up by locals, wanted to see if they could jog his memory. After he was discharged from the hospital, they paid him another visit, and with his consent, they hypnotized Niels and asked him again, "Who killed your friends? What did you see?" In his interview, the results were more concrete. Niels described the attack, fighting to get free of the tent as the intruder battered away from the outside. He said he got free of the canvas, only for the mysterious man to kick him in the jaw, breaking it and knocking him unconscious. Afterward, he was left for dead. Niels described the attacker as a man around 20 to 30 years old, about 5'8", with blonde hair combed back and a strong chin. This was promising news. His description seemed to match up with the figure multiple eyewitnesses placed near the scene. The police hypnotized the 14-year-old who claimed to have seen the blonde man and again asked for a description. He said the same thing, a blonde man with a square jaw. Using the descriptions given by Niels and the eyewitness, the police were able to create a rough composite sketch of the man they were looking for. The 3 deceased teens were buried the following week. The event was photographed by the press, and when these photos were developed afterward, they revealed something that no one noticed at the time. Among the crowd of heartbroken mourners, there stood an unidentified man, a blonde man with a strong jawline. The authorities' first real lead on a suspect came from the staff of Helsinki Surgical Hospital, located about 25 kilometers southeast of Lake Bodom. On June 6th, the Monday after the murders, a distressed blonde man was brought into the ward. He had requested urgent assistance, though the doctors didn't notice anything physically wrong with him. His shirt was stained red with what he claimed was paint. This man, as it turned out, was already known to the Finnish police. He was a 36-year-old German expatriate named Hans Assmann. His background was shrouded in mystery due to his habit of lying and exaggerating his past. Unsubstantiated claims Hans had made about himself included that he was a Nazi guard at Auschwitz, was reassigned when he fell in love with a Jewish woman, and that he was recruited by the KGB after the war. In spite of a suspicious backstory, Hans had an airtight alibi. He claimed he was with a girlfriend in Helsinki at the time, and she and her family confirmed this story. It would have been nearly impossible for him to drive all the way to Lake Bodom, commit a gruesome crime, and get back to Helsinki without them noticing. The authorities dismissed him as a suspect, confident that he wasn't the man they were looking for, and his red-stained clothes were never tested. Around this time, another suspect came to their attention. It was a local named Carl Gillstrom. 50 years old, Carl owned the roadside stand that the four teens visited before heading to the lake. Though day-to-day operations were often handled by his wife and 12-year-old daughter, his wife had directly interacted with the victims on the day before the murder. Carl was the reason there were so few campers by that side of the lake. He was known to be a temperamental alcoholic who treated the shore of Lake Bodom like it was his backyard. He'd had numerous run-ins with campers and day trippers over the years and had been known to throw rocks at people, cut the cords of tents, and even fire warning shots with his shotgun. He looked nothing like the blonde man in the police sketch, but otherwise he fit the perfect profile of someone who would have a violent outburst at noisy teens. On top of that, he lived just a mere 800 meters from the scene of the crime. However, he too had an alibi. Carl's wife claimed that he was with her and their two children the entire night the murders took place, and Carl's 12-year-old daughter corroborated this story. No new leads turned up, and the case started to grow cold. The mystery deepens August 1969, 9 years after the murders at Lake Bodom. Carl Gillstrom was drunk again, as usual. He had made his house a living hell for his wife and two kids. At the tail end of his most recent binge, his daughter, now 21, had had enough. The two of them got into a heated argument, during which she threatened to call the police. Carl left the house to cool off and found a neighbor who would lend a sympathetic ear. The two men spent the afternoon together, and their conversation eventually turned serious, extremely serious. Carl confessed that something had been quietly eating away at him for years, that he, Carl Gillstrom, was the man responsible for the Lake Bodom murders. Through tears, Carl asked what he should do. The neighbor, alarmed by this confession, replied that there was nothing for Carl to do. He might as well just walk into the lake because he had no future but jail if he confessed to the police. Carl fell silent for a long time, then finally asked for another drink. That evening, someone told Carl's son that his father was seen swimming in the lake a little before 6 p.m. Alarmed, Carl's son borrowed a boat, speeding to his father's swimming spot, but he couldn't find him out on the water anywhere. The family called the local authorities. Before long, Carl's body was found 3 meters from where the murders took place. He was clothed, with a pair of wine bottles floating alongside him. At first, Carl's wife rushed to defend her dead husband, insisting that the neighbor must have misunderstood what Carl was saying. But in time, she changed her tune. After years of claiming that Carl spent the night of the murders with her, she ultimately admitted that Carl had slept on the couch that night. She had been too afraid of her husband not to protect him. The press labeled Carl's death as a suicide, but this was never confirmed by police. For their part, they remained unconvinced that Carl was the killer. The confession was only witnessed by one person and under unreliable circumstances. Both men were drunk, and there was still no probable cause. Even though Carl was a drunk who did hate campers with a fiery passion, there's a big difference between harassing people and violently killing them. For the second time in a decade, they dismissed the possibility that Carl Gillstrom was a killer. Meanwhile, the other long-dismissed Lake Bodom suspect, Hans Assmann, actively cultivated a reputation as a Lake Bodom boogeyman. He eagerly told fanciful, unverifiable stories of his life to true crime magazines. He claimed, among other things, that he was a member of the German SS during the Second World War, and that he was later employed by the KGB. Though he never admitted anything about Lake Bodom, it was clear that he enjoyed the limelight. Finally, in 1997, at the age of 73, he invited a journalist to his deathbed. In a rambling interview, he alleged his own involvement in a number of unspecified crimes. The journalist assumed that Hans was referencing another unsolved double murder in the area from 1959, just a year before Lake Bodom. This case, in which 2 young campers were killed in their tent at night near a lake, bore undeniable similarities to the Lake Bodom case. However, when the journalist inquired directly about Lake Bodom, Hans didn't confess. Ultimately, Hans Assmann died shortly thereafter, leaving his true life story clouded by exaggeration. For a while, it seemed like nothing new would ever happen to revive interest in Lake Bodom. Any hope and truth had been lost to time and crime scene mismanagement. The 90s rolled into the early 2000s, and then, shockingly, there was a sudden development. Forensic science had advanced considerably since the 1960s, prompting re-examination of old evidence. This directed police to a new suspect, and it was one who had been hiding under their nose the entire time. The accusation, and the verdict April 2004. Niels Gustafsson had lived a normal life for the past 45 years. Now in his early 60s, he was retired with a wife and 2 kids. The events of Lake Bodom seemed so distant now, like they happened to another man in another life. That is, until he received a visit from the police. They told him that he was under arrest for the murder of Anya, Mela, and Seppo, and he was shocked. There was no statute of limitations on murder, but Niels had moved on from that traumatic period of his life, or at least so he thought. The blunders the police made back in 1960 made it a particularly thorny case to relitigate. But one particular piece of evidence seemed to have opened up new possibilities. The bloody shoes that belonged to Niels, the ones that were found over a kilometer away from the scene of the crime. A forensic analysis of the shoes determined that the blood came from Niels's murdered friends, but none of it was from Niels himself. The conclusion prosecutors drew from this was that the killer was wearing shoes when he attacked the tent, and the killer, by this reasoning, was Niels himself. Menacing music. The original description Niels gave of the attacker, that of the blonde man with the square jaw, was no longer considered relevant, as it was given under hypnosis. And so, Niels was held in jail for a year, preparing for his defense. While he waited, the case became a media sensation. Long dormant speculation about the murders splashed across tabloid headlines. They now had a juicy new angle to explore in this case, the lurid story of a teen who murdered his girlfriend and got away with it for 45 years. August 2005, the trial began. The prosecution painted a damning story of what happened almost a half-century ago. They theorized that June 4th was a tense day by the lake. Niels had gotten drunk and became aggressive, fighting with his girlfriend Mela. It got so bad that he was exiled by the others from their shared tent. After midnight, Seppo attempted to calm him down. This was unsuccessful, sparking a fight between the two boys. Seppo had won this fight, explaining the blunt force trauma that Niels suffered to his jaw and skull. Seppo then returned to their tent, leaving the defeated Niels behind. Sometime after 4 a.m., when he was sure the others were asleep, Niels returned to the tent with a knife and a rock. He viciously stabbed and bludgeoned his friends to death, then made it look like a burglary. He took the keys for the motorcycles, Seppo's leather jacket, their wallets and watches, and got rid of them somewhere nearby, likely in the lake. This explained why the motorcycle keys were missing, but the murderer did not use either vehicle for a quick getaway. Once he staged the scene, Niels got rid of his shoes and returned to the scene of the crime, where he laid down beside his dead girlfriend and waited for their bodies to be discovered. The injuries Niels had received earlier that evening at the hands of Seppo helped make it seem as if the killer had attacked him as well. The prosecution's case hinged on two key pieces of evidence: the shoes, which were likely worn by the murderer, and the state of the tent, which had been slashed to ribbons. Niels, who had been found lying on top of the tent, had only received wounds to his head. The prosecutor claimed that he would have been severely cut as well if he had been inside alongside them. The other pieces of evidence were circumstantial. The state of the bodies implied things about the killer that the prosecution said could only be explained by their story. Of the three bodies, Mila's was left in the worst state. She was stabbed many times even after she died, and her lower body was stripped naked. This, the prosecution said, showed that Niels was furious at his girlfriend in particular. A random burglar would not target one of the two girls so brutally. Niels's lawyer did not account for the blood on the shoes, nor did she account for the awful state of Mela's body. But she did provide a stirring rebuttal to the allegation that her client was some sort of mastermind at staging a crime scene. If the prosecution was to be believed, then that meant Niels committed a crime of passion out of blind rage, then arranged the scene meticulously to hide his horrible deeds. She implied that someone who has just murdered 3 people on violent impulse does not lie down and pretend to be unconscious beside his victims. Besides, there was a factor that the prosecution had completely overlooked: the severity of the injuries Niels received that same night. When he was picked up by police, Niels had a broken jaw and skull fractures. He was unable to speak due to his severe head injuries. Pictures of him at the hospital following the attack showed his entire jaw bandaged and braced, and one of his eyes swollen shut. The prosecution's story alleged that these injuries came from a fight with Seppo sometime after 2 a.m. while Mila was writing in her diary, and Anya was probably already asleep. This meant that Seppo hurt his friend badly enough that Niels couldn't even talk the following morning. Would a young man with head injuries this severe be able to overpower 3 people, even if he surprised them? Would he have been able to walk half a mile away from the campsites to dispose of his incriminating shoes before returning and pretending to be unconscious? Head wounds are temperamental things. They can impede clear thought, memory, and motor functions. The version of Niels Gustafsson that the prosecution had painted was someone who was both severely injured and preternaturally controlled in his revenge. This picture of Niels, his attorney argued, did not square with the facts. Besides, there was always the fact that teenage Niels' hair was decidedly more brown than blonde. Niels, for his part, maintained that his own memory of the night in question was spotty thanks to his head injuries. In the end, the jury found Niels not guilty. He was released from custody and was allowed to return to his quiet life with his family. But even still, he was not done with his life in the spotlight. The last year had been a harrowing re-litigation of the most traumatic event of his life. And so, Niels sued the Finnish government for unjustified imprisonment. The case was settled, and Niels walked away with a payment of nearly 45,000 euros. Niels's life eventually went back to normal, and his innocence was never questioned again. Conclusion. Who was the killer? So who is responsible for the Lake Bodom murders? Was it Hans Assmann, the unreliable attention seeker who loved to imply that he knew more than he let on, even making many suspicious statements on his deathbed? Was it Carl Gillström, who was often violent toward campers at the lake he considered his property? Was it Niels Gustafsson, who committed a crime of passion that could never be proven in court? Or was it a random person, long since disappeared somewhere in Finland? Curiously, another suspect came to light in the late 1960s, just a couple of months before Carl took his own life, a man named Pentti Soininen, who hanged himself while in prison. For many years, he bragged to fellow inmates that he committed the Lake Bodom murders. He did indeed grow up near Lake Bodom, but otherwise his claims were given little credence by police. Soininen was only 14 or 15 years old at the time of the murders, and it seems unlikely he could have overpowered 4 people, 2 of whom were 18-year-old men. Though guilty of plenty of other crimes, Soininen is considered innocent in the Lake Bodom murders. However, his alleged confession shows a chilling possibility. Perhaps the murderer's name was never known to police at all. The tall, blonde man, supposedly on the shores that morning and allegedly photographed among the crowd at the funeral in 1960, was never identified. Even if he was just a bystander who looked suspicious to passers-by, the real murderer could be just as anonymous, a nameless face in the crowd that helped trample evidence after the killing. And lest we forget, the murder weapon has, to this day, never been found. Wherever it lies, whether at the bottom of Lake Bodom, buried on its shores, or somewhere else entirely, even the midnight sun may never reach it.